Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Virati.
Hare Krishna, dear devotees, welcome back to another series on Books Are the Basis, conversations on the importance of reading Srila Prabhupada's books, and we're very honored and happy to have with us today His Grace Brahmatirtha Prabhu. Hare Krishna, Prabhu, thank you so much.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you so much for joining. Of course, amongst the devotees, Brahmatirtha Prabhu is well known also from the book Perfect Questions, Perfect Answers, as Bob Cohen, and we will talk about this also. At that time, Prabhu, as a young man, went as a Peace Corps to India and also worked there as a science teacher. Prabhu has also a bachelor in chemistry. He has a master in geology, and also, has over the years worked in many different areas. He's an advisor for environmental protection agency, or worked in that field. And also he is a professional mediator, and today serves in ISKCON also as the co-director of ISKCON Resolve. And he's also the director of the Bhaktivedanta Institute for Higher Studies in Gainesville, Florida. So very active in many different ways. And we're very honored to have you with us. I'm sure it will be very interesting for us to hear your relationship with Srila Prabhupada's books, and especially also, your interaction with Prabhupada actually brought out a book, which is quite unusual. Usually when we start these interviews, we ask the devotees, what was your first interaction with Prabhupada's books, or what was the first book that you received? But in your case, your interaction with Prabhupada produced the book. Did you actually read a book before you met Prabhupada?
Yes. When I was in college, I read Dr. Radhakrishn's Gita. Prabhupada wasn't out, and I read Franklin Edgerton's Gita, and I was very fascinated. And in the late 60s, maybe 68-ish, I was in Greenwich Village in New York, just as we would say, hanging out. And I saw a chanting party with Jayadvaita Brahmachari then on it. I was amazed to see this party. These people were either one of two things: the biggest exhibitionists in Greenwich Village, because there were many exhibitionists, people who dressed weird and showed off, or they were above it all. And I didn't know which, but I was curious. And then they gave me a mantra card, which said, chant, your life will be sublime. Well, I lost the card. But at that time, the Hair album had just come out from the play Hair. So I listened to that track of Hare Krishna, ignored the second half of the track, which is Happy Marijuana, and learned the mantra. So I started chanting because I liked it. Didn't know why. And then I went to visit the temple at 26 2nd Avenue. I found the address. Took me a long time to find where the address was. You couldn't Google anything. So I found it somehow. And I went there, and they had just moved down the street to 60-something 2nd Avenue. And at that time, the movement had not yet invented the sign that you put in the window, we have moved. So it took me another 6 months to find out where they'd moved to. And I went there, and then they had moved to Brooklyn. So again, it took me a year to find out where they were. Finally, I went to Brooklyn to Henry Street. And I said, okay, now I'll find out what's going on. At that time in the 60s, it was very common after Prabhupada for a lot of gurus to come to India. Just like many Indians have come to make their fortune by owning stores or high tech or hotels. The first generation came by the guru business was better. And so it was hard to tell who's real and who's not. She says, I'll go to the temple and check it out. So when I went to the temple, it was quite mystical and quite strange. Sometimes it still feels strange, but that's another story. But it was quite mystical. And I asked for a book, and the only book they had at the temple at that time was not a book that you would normally give to a first-time visitor. It was Nectar of Devotion.
Mm.
So that's an internal book.
Yeah.
And Prabhupada did it very early for good reason. So I took it home and I said, this is going to clear up my mysteries. And when I started reading it, I couldn't tell if I was holding the book upside down or not, because it didn't make any sense to me. So that was my first encounter with a book.
Mm.
And because the Gita, I had read a few times, and I was very mystified by the Gita in college. And I was chanting Hare Krishna just because I had learned it from the street party.
Okay.
And so I was, but I wasn't, I didn't know specifically what ISKCON represented.
Yeah. Yeah. But you learned more about it when you went to India, right?
Well, I made it when I was a little boy. I decided to go to India. I was going to go to India someday. It must have been previous life. There's no explanation, because I was drawn to India like anything. And when I applied to become a volunteer in the Peace Corps, it was hard to get in the Peace Corps. But if you wanted India, you got it. It was the least desirable assignment. I found out why. That's another story. So I applied, and to my amazement, I got in. And I put as my choices of countries. They'll send you where they need you, but you can put choices. So I put India, India, and India as my three choices. And they had trouble getting anyone volunteering for India. So once I got in, that was easy. So I just had to go to India. It was a deep inner passion to make it to India. And then the other reason I wanted to go is I wanted to find out who were the legitimate spiritual leaders and who were the cheaters. The New York Daily News ran a centerfold every week. It was their weekly joke. And they take a picture of the latest guru coming to New York. They all came to New York first from India. And some of them were very strange. You had, Guru Maharajji and Rajneesh, and, it was a menagerie of odd fellows. Somehow I understood that ISKCON is probably above it all, but I wasn't sure. And the only way to know was to go to India.
And then you ended up being in Sridham Mayapur during the Gaur Purnima festival as basically the first guest at that festival.
The only guest.
Yeah.
There was 70 devotees. There was no facility at all. I mean, you couldn't buy anything, but I think one fellow drove by on a bicycle with some coconuts. There were no shops, no biscuits, certainly no pizzeria like now. The land had just been purchased. It was virtually impossible to buy land in Mayapur. And somehow a miracle happened. The land was purchased near the Yoga Pit, the birthplace of Mahaprabhu. And so Prabhupada said, we're going to do a festival.
And that was
so they set up a men's tent, a women's tent, a pandal, and Achyutananda built a hut for Prabhupada, which is still there. I was the only guest. I went there not even knowing Prabhupada was there, not knowing anything. I had been in Calcutta and I ran into the devotees. So I was very interested. So I'd go to the temple when I was in Calcutta. It was the nearest major city to me. It was like, 12-hour train ride. So I'd go there once a month and stay at the Salvation Army guest house. because my pay was very low, so like 500 rupees or something. So I would go to the temple. And one time I was there, and devotees said, we're having food relief for Bangladesh refugees. There had just been a big war between India and Pakistan. Bangladesh had been declared a separate country. So I said, that sounds interesting. And I was a teacher, but I was on break. So I went up to Mayapur.
So you went there to help serving prasadam to these refugees?
Yeah, I didn't know Prabhupada would be there. I didn't know what was going on. I just said, that sounds like something interesting. I'd like to do that. I mean, I watched the population of Calcutta double in 2 weeks, literally double in 2 weeks, because when the war came, there was a huge amount of refugees came. So I knew there was a problem. And the idea that I could help with food relief was appealing.
But then you're spending a lot of time with Prabhupada in his room and talking about life's meaning, how that took place. Prabhupada just invited you to come to the room, or?
Well, it was, Krishna works in funny ways. The wonderful devotee Tejas, who's major life membership director, saw me get off the boat coming from Navadvip. I took a train, then the boat. And he saw me, and there was, I was a clean-cut American. You didn't see them around at all, India. You only saw hippies my age. So he walked right up to me, and I said, yeah, I'm a Peace Corps worker. I want to come help. And he had been in the Peace Corps. So immediately we hit it off. And he said, would you like to see Prabhupada? Now, I had met Prabhupada briefly in Calcutta some months before. And I had asked a really dumb question. So I decided if I'm with Prabhupada again, I'll just be a listener, because a really dumb question. So he said, invited me in. And so Prabhupada and I spoke for a while. And unfortunately, it wasn't recorded, because the book begins not at the beginning. And Prabhupada did the natural conversation, who are you, why are you here, and the normal pleasantries. And my own realization is that Prabhupada realized there were 60, 70 devotees, all quite enthusiastic, some extremely enthusiastic. And if he didn't keep me with him all day, what would happen to me? Because they all wanted to preach to somebody, and there was one English-speaking person who was a guest. You know, villagers would wander in. So Prabhupada showed me a lot of mercy. And Shama Sundar, his secretary, realized this conversation was getting interesting. And cassette tapes were a rare commodity. He only had so many, but he hit the record button. And that's why it turned into a book. And after he was done, Prabhupada, Shama Sundar turned to Prabhupada and goes, those are perfect answers, Prabhupada. And Prabhupada turned to him and said, yes, we'll make a book, perfect questions, perfect answers. And then to my shock, it came out in 58 languages.
Till today, it's in 58 languages. Wow.
Yes, wow. Including one language in Africa that you say with clicking noises. Wow. Yeah, it was kind of like, well, it's as if it happened to someone else, not me. It's like, you might say, an out-of-body experience.
Now, of course, we're talking about the importance of reading Srila Prabhupada's books. You sometimes read the perfect question, perfect answers yourself, just to remember these days and Prabhupada's instructions.
It was a gift from COVID that I started reading the book. For 40 years, I would occasionally look at it, but it was just my false ego. But I was afraid if I got into the book and spoke on it, I would think I was too important. Anyway, it was just my mental process. So I was very nervous about that happening to me, because I know I'm not that important, but it's a big book and, blah, blah, blah. So when COVID came, I got a lot of requests to speak on it. So I gave up my false ego, which turned out is what it was. and started speaking on the book and reading it more. I looked at it over the years, but I refused to speak on it. So when COVID came, I got a lot of invites like today. And I realized that was what I was supposed to be doing. That, whatever I've done in devotional service, I've reached the point where it won't impact my ego in a negative way. I even took a course with you, Krishna Prema Rupa, to help me with that. That's where I met you. We took a course together, and that helped me a lot with that.
Yeah,
how to get past the course was on how to get past our false ego and how to remove the masks that we all wear. So you and I were classmates in that.
I'm just wondering, it must be quite special to have a printed book with your personal conversation with a spiritual master. I mean, we all receive instructions from our spiritual master, but rarely, these instructions are recorded or written down and even put it in a book. But yeah, that's wonderful, and I'm sure you get a lot of inspiration from reading it, and certainly we get inspiration reading this book and hearing Prabhupada's answers. Maybe we could start with a question, just in general. What benefits do devotees get if they read this book and, of course, other books by Srila Prabhupada? What's the importance of reading Prabhupada's books regularly? How would you answer that?
Devotees need to know two things. They need to know what our philosophy is, and they need to know philosophy in general. They need to know how to think logically. Otherwise, we're not going to present in a convincing way. Reading Prabhupada's books can teach us both the philosophy and philosophy. The insights Prabhupada has and the brilliance of his translations, because his translations are not literal. He wasn't trying to present a scholarly literal translation. He was trying to incorporate philosophical points in the translations. That's his style. And he talks about that. And even the preface to the Bhagavatam talks about Prabhupada's mission and why he's doing it. So in reading the books, Prabhupada instructed me to read every day. So even if I have only a few minutes, sometimes life is hectic, at least I read a few verses. And right now I'm reading Chaitanya Charitamrita, just happens to be what I'm reading. And I'm done with that, I'll do something else. And reading the books is a meditation. On your interview with Chaitanya Charan, he talked about, very clever. He said, we tend to read fast so we can get through it, but he recommended we read slow. And then he said something very important. He said that we should ask questions while we're reading. And by asking questions while we're reading, we go deeper. So he'll read a verse, and before reading the purport, try to think of a question. And invariably, the answer's in the purport, and it gets deeper. So we can read individually, we can read in groups, we can read both. Vaisheshika Prabhu does this amazing program every year at Govardhan Hill, where they just sit for a month in pre-COVID times and read Shastra and discuss it. I remember years ago, was in Washington, and I was sitting in Garuda and Yamuna and Dinatarni and a few others were having daily Bhagavatam classes. So I was invited to sit in. And I was so used to the standard ISKCON way. You give a class, a speaker speaks, at the end you answer some questions. But they did it different. They took turns reading and had a continual discussion. And something inside me said, this isn't right. This isn't Prabhupada's way. And then I realized it certainly is. They had found a deeper way of getting into the books that worked for that group. So There's no hard and fast rules on this, but what can we do to get deeper in the books? And the recommendation is discussing it, because if we look at the Bhagavatam, it is mostly questions and answers and layered of questions and answers. Sukadev is answering and Sukta is asking and Parikshit's asking, just layers of question answers, because that is the way to learn. And Prabhupada wrote me and told me, keep asking questions. And he said it very significant phrase. He said, from different points of view. Now, I'm a mediator. One reason I took up mediation in ISKCON, I was trained in ISKCON, then I was trained in graduate school and trained in the courts, so 20 years of training. But when I took it up, I saw it as a ticket for me. I had a problem, and my problem was I didn't feel Samadarshana, equal vision. The dog eater, the elephant, the Brahmin. I made a lot of distinctions. Who's better, who's worse. And if we want to see the one behind the many, we have to see deeper beyond the superficials. And I saw mediation, as soon as the first 5 minutes of the first ISKCON mediation class went on, I realized this is my ticket to Samadarshana. And Samadarshana is very important if for my own spiritual life, maybe for others too, but for myself, not to be so judgmental. It's very easy when we're in a movement to be judgmental. I was brought up in a Jewish family. We're the chosen people. I rebelled against that. I found that chosen. I know me. You got to be kidding. I mean, what? God, if I'm the chosen one, we're in trouble. And then it was us and the karmis, and something just didn't resonate with me. So mediation gave me a way to get Samadarshana. Then when I started reading the books after studying mediation, gave me a whole new insight that there are many ways to look at it. And having what I particularly liked about that class back in the 80s in Washington is people were revealing their mind, discussing, raising their doubts. So we need our structured Bhagavatam classes. I'm not advocating against it. I give Bhagavatam classes. I attend Bhagavatam classes. But we also need to discuss the books, and we need to have doubts. Doubts are healthy. If one is a radical skeptic and they doubt everything, they're a lost soul. But if one doesn't have any doubts, there's no questions raised, then we're not thinking very much. And the whole Gita is a bunch of doubts. Arjuna, hey, Krishna, you said one thing and then you said something else. I don't get it. Will you explain this to me? I mean, that happens several times in the Gita. So having our doubts and being able to voice our doubts, being able to express it in a safe way, that I don't understand this, that is how we make advancement. So if we're reading the books in this questioning mood, I mean, there's a certain point where we become faithful. And Prabhupada said that to me. I'll read it. He says, yes, having some faith in me and this Krishna conscious process is the first and only requirement for actual wisdom. If there is faith, understanding will follow. So I'm not advocating we don't have faith. And as your understanding increases, so will your disgust with the spell of illusionary energy. And then you voluntarily give up your entanglements. And he said to me, if you get knowledge, tapasya will follow, and then you'll make your advancement in spiritual life. So to get knowledge is the first item for anyone who's hoping to find the perfection of life. Therefore, I advise you to read our books daily as far as possible and try to understand the subject matter from different angles of vision by discussing it frequently. I was in New York then with the devotees at the New York Temple. In this way, you will gradually become convinced and by your sincere attitude and devotional service, you will make progress.
Wow. That's beautiful. It's such a powerful point you made, that when we read Prabhupada's books, we understand philosophy, but we also learn how to think, how to, to really digest and absorb this philosophy. And you emphasize the point of having question and answers, which of course makes sense also when we know your story. That's, how you came close to Prabhupada through this question and the answers. But it happens so that that's actually also the process which Prabhupada recommended in the letter that you just shared with us, that we do need to discuss this philosophy. We have to come together and really try to understand it deeper and deeper. That's thank you for sharing.
I might add, I grew up with an undiagnosed vision disability. So I couldn't play ball. I didn't know why. Later, I discovered why. But I was even operated on when I was 4, and the doctor botched it. Things weren't well known then. So I had to, I couldn't be as social as my friends were, living in a suburb and in the New York area. Kids play ball, are very social. So I had to be by myself and think a lot. And it's something I know, Krishna Prema Rupa, you'll feel very at home with.
Yes.
And in this thinking, I got very bewildered by one topic, and that was death. Because I knew intuitively no one could die, but I was watching my neighbor's grandparents dying, and then my own grandmother. And I was very bewildered by death. So I kept trying to find answers. So when I met Prabhupada, I was still 22, but I had had 10 years of thinking about this. So I wasn't an entirely blank slate walking in. I had had things that had been on my mind. So that gave me a good opportunity.
Yeah, you came from an academic background and you were really searching.
Yeah. And my generation was a kind of a searching generation, but I had some unique circumstances that made it a little difficult growing up because I couldn't socialize very well. And it was such a blessing. I'm just so thankful for the blessing.
I forgot to ask you when you mentioned about your interaction with Prabhupada there in Mayapur. In these, I think it was 4 days, you had these conversations. Would you like to share with us what happened in a sense of, by associating with Prabhupada, asking these questions, I'm sure your own faith in Krishna consciousness and in Prabhupada must have grown. Something must have happened, a transformation in your heart during these days.
Yeah, I had my doubts, but Prabhupada is such a nice person. Simple as that. Prabhupada never made me feel belittled or judged or inferior. I was very confessional in the book about my own weaknesses, something I would never tell anybody else. And I just told him because he made me feel so comfortable. And Prabhupada was a lot funnier than those of us at the time knew, because it was a cultural difference, Bengali and Americans. And there was another difference. There was a 50-year age gap. And so there was a generational difference, many generations. And so Prabhupada was a lot funnier. When I listen to him and read now, it was a lot funnier than we knew at the time. But that ambiance he had made me feel very comfortable. And when I would sit with Prabhupada, I'd be looking at his feet. I don't know why, just instinctively, because he was on a raised platform. I was on a mat on the floor. And I thought I was alone with Prabhupada and with just Shama Sundar there. But I didn't know the whole doorway was heads all the way around. People told me later, I didn't know. So Prabhupada was kind of mesmerizing. And he would call me in 2-3 times a day over these 3 days to speak.
Wow.
I was out just serving out khichdi to refugees. That's what I came for. And part of that was I was the only English-speaking guest. And part of it was Prabhupada was particularly kind, and he saw that I really wanted to know something.
Mm. And afterwards, you joined the movement full time?
Well, I was engaged to be married before I met Prabhupada.
Yeah.
And my poor wife, who's a first-class devotee, we married 50 years, but
Wow.
I knew she was very spiritual. She knew I was spiritual. And when I received my letter saying I've been accepted in India, I was just graduating college. We were talking about getting married. She said, "Oh, I'll wait for you." Next thing I knew, I was on a plane to India. And so when I came back and I got off the plane, she was waiting at the airport with her girlfriend. She didn't recognize me. I had different glasses. I'd lost a lot of weight. I was wearing just what I wore in India, which is kurta, Indian style clothes. And I thought it was very funny. And so she had no idea about Krishna, and no idea. And I'd written letters from India, but before I met Prabhupada, you might say I had what we would call an altered state of consciousness. And then when I met Prabhupada, I immediately cleaned up my act. So when I wrote her and told her what happened, she thought I'd really taken the heavy stuff. And then I took her to the temple July 4th, 72, and Prabhupada was there. And she met Prabhupada, and it changed her heart like anything. And because she was never a hippie, and the devotees, almost 99% came from hippie background. So she couldn't relate to the devotees at all, hardly at all. So when she met Prabhupada, she realized that. And I was chanting 16 rounds and following. And so I saw myself, then I began grad school. I'd applied when I was in India. And I ran a Krishna yoga club on campus and do programs and regularly go to the temples, just gradually increasing more and more.
Getting back to
yeah, go on.
Yeah, getting back to the books. I mean, if you nowadays read Srila Prabhupada's books, we know the statement that Prabhupada mentioned that he forever lives in his books. Would you like to share any realization on this? How do you feel Prabhupada's presence when you read some of his books?
I was with Haridas Maharaj in 1980, 81, when he was translating the 11th canto.
Okay.
And he's a polyglot. He learns languages like I cannot understand. I mean, 6 languages. He can learn a language on a flight to a country. I mean, his brothers like that too. They got that chip. So he was learning Sanskrit and started translating. And he felt it had to be done and it wasn't happening fast enough. And as he would cover up Prabhupada's translation and do his own in not the 11th canto, but earlier cantos to learn. And he would constantly yell, "Eureka, brilliant." He was so amazed how Prabhupada perfectly incorporated deeper meaning than just literally putting the words on a piece of paper. And that really struck me, how impressed he was, because he was looking at it, later he got his PhD in Sanskrit, but at that time he was looking at it as a student of Sanskrit, amazed at Prabhupada's ability to convey so much. So I'll never be tired of reading Prabhupada's books. Prabhupada had like the Krishna book. We're not allowed to touch Krishna 10th canto until we go through the first 9. But Prabhupada was able to incorporate all 9 cantos into Krishna book. So you can immediately develop a taste of how wonderful Krishna is without becoming offensive, because people who get in the 10th canto easily become offensive. I mean, anyone who's been to India knows that can happen because the culture understands Krishna enough about him, but doesn't study many don't study the 9 cantos first. So reading Prabhupada's books is always has more and more insight. Now, sometimes we run into an issue, some controversies. Prabhupada made controversial statements. There's a lot of discussion. Anyone who has the misfortune of being on Facebook or the internet knows about this. There are many controversial lines. Prabhupada dealt with that very well. In the preface to every volume of the Bhagavatam, every single volume, Prabhupada refers to 1:5:11. And that verse, on the other hand, that literature is full of descriptions of the transcendental glories, name, fame, etc., and full of transcendental words directed towards bringing about a revolution in the impious lives of the misdirected civilization. Then he says, and then the verse says, such transcendental literature, even though imperfectly composed, are heard, sung, and accepted by purified men who are thoroughly honest. Now, that verse is so important that every single volume of the Bhagavatam references it. And in the purport, Prabhupada says that our presenting this matter in adequate language, especially a foreign language, will fail. And there'll be many literary discrepancies despite our honest attempt to present it in the proper way. But we're sure that with all of our faults in this connection, the seriousness subject matter will be taken into consideration, and the leaders will accept this due to be an honest attempt to glorify the Almighty God. Now, that is such an important point. I mean, Prabhupada was important because it's the beginning of every book. And what is Prabhupada saying here? Now, let's talk about, I'm presenting this in adequate language, especially a foreign language. I can say without a doubt that Prabhupada's English and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's English has a greater vocabulary than most of ours, certainly than mine. I mean, when I read Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, I have to have a dictionary right next to me. And so when Prabhupada says adequate language, Prabhupada obviously his English was quite good. So what's Prabhupada saying? He says, I'm presenting in a foreign language, it will certainly fail. To me, that means cultural. He's speaking in a different cultural context, because the English is fine, the grammar is fine. It might be Indian grammar as opposed to American grammar, but that's neither here nor there. The English is fine, the vocabulary, the context, the clarity, they're all there. So Prabhupada was speaking in a cultural context. So that's how I deal with the issue of statements that raise eyebrows, statements people are concerned about. Understand that Prabhupada was speaking in a cultural context, and he expected us. He said many times, present it in your own words. So Prabhupada expected us to do 2 things. One, really understand it. And 2, be able to present in our own modern language. So when I read Prabhupada's books, that's a challenge to me to understand very deeply, and then to think, how can I present it so my audience in 2022 can understand it without changing the message at all? And in order to do that, Prabhupada gave another instruction, very important. We have to keep ourselves somewhat pure. Otherwise, that process fails. It's not a mechanical process. No computer can do what we're trying to do. Hope I didn't go on too long there. Got on my soapbox for a moment.
No, but the point that yes, we all know that there is controversial statements in Prabhupada's books, but you're saying that we better try to deeply understand and then try to find ways to express it in a way that the modern people in today's world can understand, rather than try to change Prabhupada's books or do something. Yeah, Prabhupada's statements are there, but we need to find ways how to explain them.
Yeah, I mean, the book changing is, of course, a controversy.
Another topic.
It is. I always felt the simple solution is we put footnotes. We have one scholarly edition. Prabhupada said this, and then the editors maybe, well, like, for example, this has been long corrected, but when Prabhupada said Pitris, the original edition said Planet of Trees. I mean, obviously you correct that, but you just put a footnoted edition out. So, you can have the change in the footnote, the change in the text, just one scholarly edition so people know. It takes away the whole controversy. Now, when we get to things like the rape verse and other verses, we have to look at it. I gave a class recently on the 9th canto, and I was studying it deeply, and I came across a very interesting realization that we can only get by studying the books deeply. Some women have raised the issue, and they raised it to me, very wonderful Vaishnav ladies, that the 9th canto seems to be bashing women. There's some verses in there that are unfortunately quoted that are not very, some women would take some offense. But as I read through the 9th canto, I realized Prabhupada is an equal opportunity basher, because he bashed the men just equally as much. In fact, in some cases, they were the biggest fools. So Prabhupada was an equal opportunity basher, which brings me to a point. One of the biggest dangers, I asked one of the leaders of the movement from Europe, I don't have permission to quote him, so I'll just say a very, very prominent devotee. And I asked him this question: what's the most dangerous thing for the movement? And he didn't think a moment, and he answered, Prabhupada says. Because there's no philosophical context. It's just throwing quotes. There's no deeper thought. It's just Prabhupada says. That's very dangerous. So we need to understand things in context. We understand things deeper. And that's why Prabhupada ordered us. He had told the book distributors, don't just distribute, read them, because we need to understand it. And the only way, for me at least, to understand it is to take it from a curious point of view. I look at the books with curiosity. I try to keep that almost childlike curiosity. What's going on here? And by looking at the books from the vantage point of curiosity, it helps me go deeper. Now, sometimes I'll do that on my own, sometimes with others. It depends on circumstance.
So again, that's kind of the active reading where I have a question in mind, or I'm open to explore, find something in Prabhupada's message.
Very much so. Yeah. And sometimes there's passive reading too. If somebody's reading passively, just reading, that's okay too. Active reading can stimulate more realizations, but sometimes we'll read passively. That's also okay.
Maybe since you're also serving as the director for the Bhaktivedanta Institute in Gainesville, Florida, it would be interesting to talk to you also about the role of Srila Prabhupada's books and the scientific preaching. How would you like to share some realizations on how reading Prabhupada's books, understanding Prabhupada's deeply, helped you also in the scientific preaching? On how do you, ways to explain Prabhupada's teachings to the modern world, scientific world?
So Rup Damodar Maharaj really set the stage for this in a brilliant way. We walk on two legs. One, and to use this metaphor, one of our legs for the BI is the physical sciences, and the other is the metaphysics. And if we cut off the metaphysical leg, which those who believe life comes from matter do, and we just don't deal with metaphysics, then we're hobbling around. We don't get very far on one leg. So in order for the BI to be successful, we need to combine metaphysics with physics and biology, whatever other sciences. And it's Prabhupada's books that give us the metaphysics.
This is like the basis from where you get all the deeper understanding of the metaphysics in this.
Yeah, if I am examining my hot drink cup, now I can put this under a microscope. I can run a spectrometer of what it's made of. I can control it. And so for examining things that are less than us, where consciousness matters less, we can do that in the laboratory. For understanding things that are greater than us, it's a different method. For example, if I wanted to get something from the president of a country, I can't demand anything. I'm a nobody. But if I please him, then I can get what I need. Prabhupada gave me the example. He said, if you see Mr. Birla, who was at that time the richest man in India, he's not going to give you any attention. But you give his kid a 2-cent candy, and Birla is going to be listening to everything you say. So if we want to learn from, we want to learn about that which is greater than us, we need to go to some authority. If we want to learn that which is less than us, we can do that in our laboratory. We still have to go to authorities. I mean, I studied under all these professors. I didn't learn what I know on my own. But nevertheless, we can still deal with it in a laboratory kind of setting. So the Prabhupada's books allow us to connect with the higher essence, to connect with the higher essence, we need a service attitude. So scientists will absolutely be bewildered without a service attitude. So at the BI, it's important we cultivate both our own devotional life and our scientific knowledge. We just did a workshop on the mind-brain interface. So these are experiments based on science. We had the first time in BI's history we ever had real working scientists sitting on a table. In my days of the BI, none of us were working scientists. Not in academia, we maybe had a job or full-time devotees. And so we had real devotee working scientists sitting around a table for several days, exploring the mind-brain interface and bringing in experiments on placebo effects, neural plasticity, combined with insights from Sankhya and Patanjali. What an exciting time.
That sounds very fascinating. Is there any way you share the outcome of such gatherings? Are you planning to produce a book or some?
Yeah, you asked the right question. We will. We've been working on this work group for a year. We finally had enough of a break in COVID right before Omicron hit that we could meet in person, and then that's finished now. And we will. We're not there yet, but we formed a Slack group and it is active. And I said, these are working scientists, all PhDs and philosophers. It's very important. Our scientists will be hobbling on one leg without the philosophers, and the philosophers will also be hobbling on one leg without the science, because As Prabhupada said in his very first book, Easy Journey to Other Planets, the scientists have made great progress. They just have a pinprick. They're missing philosophy. So at the BI, we try to walk on both legs. It's not always easy.
So now we heard a lot of, you shared about your personal interaction with Srila Prabhupada. You spoke about your experience with mediation and how that helped you to develop that Samadarshana vision. I found it very interesting. And now we also spoke about your experience in science preaching. And slowly, when we come to an end of this conversation, it would be interesting to understand how you see the way of applying the wisdom. We have received so much wisdom from Srila Prabhupada and these books, but how do we make sure that we apply all that knowledge? Do we have any personal suggestion how devotees can, bring this knowledge into life? And
very good question. I'm not saying to compliment you, Amita, you're one of my favorite interviewers of all time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I like where you go. Prabhupada understands that it's not good for most of us, a few of us maybe, but most of us, not to be bhajanandis, sitting just chanting all day. Sometimes it's good to take a month off, go to Govardhan and do that, to recharge our batteries, but recharge our batteries to do something. And what Prabhupada wanted us to do is help people, be of service. And I started signing my letters a little different. We mostly, devotees are used to signing letters, your servant, which is interesting how Thomas Jefferson and John Adams would always sign their letters to each other. It's an old English way of speaking. It's very nice. So, but I want to go a little deeper. So I started signing them yours in service. And that was just from me. I'm not saying anybody should do it, but I wanted to keep reminding myself that to me, service is an active word, not a passive word. Mm-hmm. And so if we're thinking, what can we do to help people from suffering? What can we do to be kind? Help in what ways? Then the messages of the books become deeper realizations for us. And it takes away our layers of false ego. For example, anyone that goes on serious book distribution will know their false ego is constantly tested. And the same thing in the BI when we meet with scientists. I watched Srup Damodar Maharaj, who was like the master at this, when he would meet with various scientists. He would have to go through such austerity to win them over, but he did. So each of us have a different tapasya that Krishna has personally given us to help us overcome our own spiritual anarthas. So one man's food certainly can be another man's poison.
So basically you're saying finding our dharma, like engaging ourselves in the service to society and people in general, by trying to apply that knowledge in the sense of becoming a servant and doing service, preaching that knowledge, then this will help us to realize and deepen our understanding of Prabhupada's books.
Very much so.
Yeah. That's a very practical advice to combine the study with service, with preaching, with helping Prabhupada's mission.
And if we get too involved in our service, that's dangerous. If we get too involved in just studying, that's dangerous. We need to be Buddha-like and take the middle road.
Finding that balance.
And Krishna says that in the Gita. Krishna advocates certainly way ahead of the Buddha. He said, don't eat too much, don't eat too little, don't sleep too much, don't sleep too little. So Krishna is advocating a middle way. So to balance our life is not always easy. I have mentors who help me with this. I mean, I spend time each week, 1 or 2 hours with mentors who guide me because I'm very busy and I'll easily get my life unbalanced. So I realize that. So I go to mentors to check in on me. How am I doing?
Wow. That's also an interesting aspect, because often devotees say they don't have time, they don't find time to read. But at the end of the day, it seems to be more a question of time management and organizing one's life. And as you mentioned, finding that balance.
One time in Fiji, the wonderful devotee Nityananda, Dallas Temple president, was there. And he was the enemy of the movement. He wanted to get the movement thrown out. These are phony Hindus. So he met Tamal Krishna Maharaj. And Tamal Krishna Maharaj turns to him and says, so what do you do all day? So he's telling him what he does. He says, you're not very good at time management. And he started giving him instructions on time management. And Nityananda is I came here to get the movement thrown out, and he's trying to help me fix my time management. And after a while, it softened him up. And then Nityananda, if I got the story right, Tamal Krishna is challenging him. He says, why don't you stay with us for a month? And after a month, if you think we're phony, we'll leave Fiji. You don't have to have us kicked out. So he studied for a month and became a great devotee. So it was very interesting. Tamal Krishna Maharaj was brilliant at time management. I mean, I watched that. I was his secretary at various times, and I watched that. And it's very important. I'm not very good at it, so I take mentorship on it. But time management is a critical skill. Prabhupada was perfect at time management, and Prabhupada never suffered jet lag. So, but the rest of us aren't so good at it. So it's something we have to work on. So we all need to help each other with time management. It's a critical aspect. I use the excuse I don't have time, and that's not a fair excuse.
Yeah, I liked how you shared with us that Prabhupada gave you that personal instruction of reading daily, and you make it a point to read every day, because even if you're busy, but I think it's about this feeling that connection, or being connected with Prabhupada through his books on a daily basis. And if there is more time, we can read more, if less, but we should stay connected. So yeah, that's very inspiring to hear from you, being such a busy person also. I don't know, you have any maybe final message before we come to an end with this conversation, some final thoughts, words to our listener?
Yeah, I'm looking at some notes here. Embrace Prabhupada's books, yet question them. Be like Sukadev, like Arjuna, like Parikshit. Journal your doubts, write down your doubts and explore them. And it's practically a miraculous process how your doubts take you deeper. And you even wonder, how did I ever doubt that? So the questions are healthy if they're not done from a radical skeptical point of view, and they're done from the mode of goodness. So if we keep ourselves as close to the mode of goodness as we can, we're not all perfect, we keep ourselves as close to the mode of goodness as we can, then our questions will be proper, insightful, asked in the right way. When I met Prabhupada, I accidentally hit a formula. I didn't know this formula. Krishna says in the Gita, approach a spiritual master, inquire submissively, render service, and he can give you the truth. So Krishna says that in the Gita. So I accidentally did that. When I met Prabhupada, that part wasn't accidental, but submissive. After I'd asked the one foolish question when I met Prabhupada earlier, I said, I'm not going to tried to doubt Prabhupada. I'm going to assume that Prabhupada is a bona fide guru because I have some evidences. And later on, I'll process that and figure it out. But for now, I'm going to approach him submissively and just see what I can learn. And later I can analyze it. So I accidentally hit inquire submissively. Render service. I was feeding refugees every minute I wasn't with Prabhupada. And so I accidentally approached Prabhupada humbly and submissively. And sure enough, what did he do? As the Gita predicted, gave the truth. So that formula works. So I'd say the same thing. Approach humbly, submissively, but inquire. Prabhupada said, if people come on blind faith, they leave on blind faith. They leave easily. It's not cheap. So that was all. I'm sure most in your audience know it already. And maybe I'm saying this more from me than them, but it's good for me to hear it too.
Thank you so much. I think for all of us, it was very, very inspiring to get to know you better, the person behind the perfect question, perfect answers. And I really found it very inspiring. It's fascinating how this topic of asking questions and having doubts and that came up again and again in our conversation. And it really makes sense when we know who you are and your background and conversation with Prabhupada. So I thank you very, very much for giving us your precious time and sharing your realizations. It was really wonderful. Thank you. And
thank you very much. I'm happy to see you again after a good number of years. And I pray that Krishna makes our path cross again and again.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. Hare Krishna, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.